Thanks, everybody. We've had an amazing day. And for our final talk of the day, and we will have recordings up in the next few days, probably by early next week, but you'll see some of them come soon. We have just an amazing session happening now. Two outstanding leaders in all of technology, creating a responsible and safe, sustainable future for AI. Dr. Genevieve Bell, I did put her Hall of Fame video in the chat, founded the 3A Institute at Australian National University, where she is a director of the School of Cybernetics. We also have another Hall of Famer and the first WITI Silicon Valley member, Dr. Carolyn Turbyfill. She's also served on the advisory board for ASTIA, formerly Women's Technology Cluster. Both of these amazing leaders are inductees into the Hall of Fame, as I mentioned earlier. I could go on and on about both of them, but with that, I'm going to remove myself and turn it over to the two of you.
Okay, we've started, right?
Yep.
Hi, my name is Dr. Carolyn Turbyfill, and I am honored to introduce Distinguished Professor Dr. Genevieve Bell. Dr. Bell is the director of the School of Cybernetics, director of the 3A Institute, and the Florence Violet McKenzie Chair at the Australian National University. She is also a vice president and a senior fellow of Intel Corporations. She has many other titles, but I don't have time to read them all. Genevieve completed her PhD in cultural anthropology at Stanford University in 1998. She is best known for her work at the intersection of cultural practice and technology development, and widely recognized as an influential voice within academia, industry, and government. Genevieve will be talking about creating a responsible, safe, and sustainable future for AI. Welcome, Dr. Bell.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's lovely to be here.
So I'll just go ahead and get started with our questions. The first one is, how did you come to create the 3A Institute and now a new School of Cybernetics?
Gosh, it's a short story and a long story to that. So the School of Cybernetics came into existence here at the Australian National University on January 4th, 2021. So 6 months ago, just about. It was a moment in time of us trying to think about how do we tell an optimistic story about the future? How do we also build on everything we learned during the pandemic, which really is about, well, for me at least, one of the big insights out of the pandemic is that the system and the idea of the system feels like the most important kind of, critical theoretical lens to apply to the 21st century. And when I think about systems, I want to think about complicated systems and complex systems. I want to think about systems that hold people and technology and ecology in some kind of dynamic loop. And the only kind of people that are good at doing that are the people who are trained as cyberneticians in the field of cybernetics. And cybernetics is an old word and an old story. If it vaguely rings somewhere in the back of your head, that's because science fiction has been holding the world cybernetics for us, waiting for us to catch back up to it again. There's a term that was coined in the 1940s in America. It was a term that was coined by a group of people who were trying to imagine what would the world look like after World War II, and how could you imagine building a state of things that felt forward-looking and optimistic, and also that didn't feel like computing was going to be used for evil and ill. And they were really interested in how to think about building a new world. And so when we came to thinking about how did we want to name what we were doing here, how did we want to kind of signal that we were looking forward, that we were optimistic, but that we were also interested in building things, we decided that it was time to bring cybernetics back. I figure it's an idea whose time has yet come. So that's a happy thing. So that's the school of that. The School of Cybernetics here builds on an earlier organization I started here at the Australian National University nearly 4 years ago when I came home. So I'd spent, that's where we've crossed paths before, Carolyn, I spent 20 plus years in Silicon Valley, mostly at Intel, and did my PhD at Stanford. And then I came back to Australia in 2017 to build something new here. And then my impulse was really about what would it take to develop well, a framework for managing artificial intelligence and for managing it safely, responsibly, and sustainably. And I figured, well, what that actually needs is a new branch of engineering. And there's nothing like the hubris of waking up one day and saying, I shall invent a new branch of engineering, and have everyone go, what? You go, no, really, it's a good idea. And so I convinced some people they should come on that crazy journey with me. And so I have this amazing collection of people here. They're extraordinary. They are brave and generous and smart and committed to building something new. And so we've been together one way or another now here for 3.5, nearly 4 years. And we keep growing, and we've collected graduate students and PhD students and new employees and hopefully some new friends in the world. And we're going to keep trying to build something new. Because I sometimes get asked as a futurist, am I optimistic or pessimistic about the future? And usually my answer is to say, listen, I think the only future you have is the one you make. And so I want to be making one that's better than the place we find ourselves now.
Well, thank you. That was very
more than you were
informative.
expecting.
No, I'm kind of wowed by that, actually. Let me see if I can remember the second question. Tell us about, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, the first question was, how did you end up here? And the second question.
Okay, so can you tell us about the work the school is doing, the School of Cybernetics?
Absolutely. So we're a brand new school, which means we don't yet have undergraduate education. We just have graduate programs. So we have a master's degree of applied cybernetics. It's a tiny cohort. There's 10 students this year because it's my pandemic year. I had 20 last year. They're from all over the world. This year, they're mostly Australians, but they have backgrounds in all kinds of different things. So everything from art and architecture to physics, chemistry, computer science, the law. They've come from all kinds of different places, big companies, government, the army, running their own businesses. My student cohorts, on our third cohort now, have always been 50% female. So we have real sort of diversity, and I have had Indigenous students here. We've had students from, like I said, all over the world. So we have a really robust, diverse student cohort. We tend to try and teach them how to think about the world through 3 kinds of ways. Build on the model I learned in primary school: heads, hearts, and hands. So you need to give people physical things to be doing. You need to engage their brains, but if it doesn't have a purpose and a reason to it, it's not something you should do. And so for us, we're trying to motivate all 3 of those pieces. So the courses, we teach people to program, because I figure, well, you don't want to turn everyone into a coder. You need to know how code works in order to have reasonable conversations about the future. I'm old enough that I learned to program at high school and at university, and I learned Pascal, which dates me. Not quite Fortran, but it might as well be. But it taught me how to think about a program and how to think about the function of software. And whilst you wouldn't want me programming anything these days, not even in Python, which I can do this much of, I at least understand how things work. And so it makes me a better person to be in those conversations. So we teach people how to think about those things. We also give people an exposure to algorithms and machine learning and data visualizations. We make people build stuff. I, for a while, thought I was the only lab on campus that had a sewing machine and a 3D printer. Because, how are you going to do things like that? Oh, you may laugh, Carolyn, but the very first thing we've made our students do for a couple of years now is when they turn up, their first exercise is to make a circuit with a light on it, so an LED light. But the circuit is connective thread, and the medium is a piece of fabric. So you have all these people sitting there with an embroidery hoop and conductive thread trying to make a light block up, basically doing the nano arts. And that's a good thing. So, we try to engage people sort of with what are the building blocks of the world that's coming, the building blocks from the technology, but also the building blocks from the social. So how do you think about how regulation is made and how humans think about systems and safety? And we do all of that. So we have a master's program, we have a PhD program. We do a lot of micro learning stuff. So we go and teach in other places and take what we know and break it into smaller and smaller pieces and hopefully give people new ideas to think with. We do a bunch of research. We're just finishing up a project at the moment. It has been printed out and is on the floor because I like to see the whole document. And it currently runs the length of the school. That is a report on the future of libraries to go to our national library. We've done research projects looking at scientists on the Barrier Reef, miners in big autonomous mines, people inside buildings. So lots of research projects. And then trying to sort of think about what are the big questions we should be asking and how would you frame them? And all of that said, we move to a new building in, like 10 working days. So there's mild panic. I think we're very excited about trying to replan ourselves in a new space. So it'll be cool.
Okay, this question I have to read because I keep tripping on the phrasing. What do you mean by decolonizing our imaginations with AI?
What do I mean about that? That's a good question. No, it's good. So one of the ways I like to think about technologies is they don't just exist as we build them. They also exist in our imaginations, right? For many of us, the first computers we ever saw were in the movies or on television, right? The first time we saw speech recognition was maybe in Star Trek, where it worked flawlessly, and it's never worked that well since. Star Trek did natural language processing. You could just say you didn't have to, you didn't need a wake-up word. It handled accents, really quite sophisticated. And for many of us, the first places we've encountered technologies was in science fiction, right? Or in the movies, in television, in books, cartoons, comics. And that shaped the way we thought it should work. That was what in my business we'd call the socio-technical imagination. But basically that, objects have a life beyond the way they're actually made. They're a life that we imagine. And one of the challenges with that imagination is that it sometimes holds our ability to make new things hostage. We think that it should look like it should in the movies. It feels like it should just be a completely different thing, right? That it's our expectation of it and even our way of thinking about it gets framed by those things, right? There's a lot to be said that our acceptance of voice recognition was held back because we expected it to work as well as it had in the movies, and it just didn't, right? And so one of the challenges when you think about new technologies is how do you make sure that we're not being held hostage to the way we imagine them or the stories we tell about them and about the kind of the narrow frame that sometimes creates. And when we talk about AI, we sometimes talk about it both as though it were, a new thing, which of course it isn't. The first conversations about AI were back in the 1950s. We sometimes talk about it as though it was supposed to be the human intellect. And of course it wasn't, it was about just doing sort of tasks that required higher order thinking. And then when we teach people about AI now, we tend to limit the texts they read. We tend to erase certain figures from those stories. We tend to pretend as though robots came into existence through science and laboratories, whereas in fact they were invented in a play in the 1920s. And there were early automata all over the world, notably in Persia and the Ottoman Empire. And, the first sort of mechanical automata were mostly created in Baghdad in the 12th and 13th centuries and, elaborated in Japan in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, long before they came to the West. And so when I talk about decolonizing our imagination, what I mean is how do you simultaneously resist the kind of force of a narrative that says it's all neat and tidy and it's just this one trajectory? How do you destabilize what appears to be this very tidy story and say, well, actually, now hold on a second. Who was there in 1956 and why were those the people whose voices we remember? And who else might have been in those conversations? So effectively for me, decolonization, or that is a move that comes out of both politics and critical studies. It comes out of subaltern studies in the academy. It was a way of starting to say, how do you read against the grain of a story to find all the other pieces in it? So for me, it's partly about, can we tell a set of stories about the history, the present and the future of AI that make room for other things? Whether that's about not reproducing human intellect, but thinking about the intelligence of bees and octopuses. Maybe it's about saying AI is not just about productivity and efficiency. Maybe it's about beauty and wonder and splendor. It could be about saying that there are forms of Indigenous and Aboriginal instantiations of AI where the logic of the machine follows a completely different idea than the one that was reified in Dartmouth in 56. But effectively, it's me trying to find a way to crack open what feels like a very small interpretation and make room for other voices and other possibilities and other histories so that we can, maybe make room for something a little more rich moving forward.
Well, I understand it now, but I think my brain is way too colonized. I don't know. I'm going to have to.
Most of ours are.
We're going to have a revolution up there. That's what I think has got to happen. So, what is the influence of the Internet of Things on AI?
That's a good question too. So, one of the fascinating things about the way we have thought about computing and the internet was that we often thought it would be humans sitting on all the nodes. That's certainly the original version of the internet, was that each one of those node points around the old ARPANET would be a terminal in a university staffed by a researcher connecting other researchers, right? It was very much about a network to share, ideas between researchers. Of course, as soon as you create all those endpoints, you open up the possibility that sitting on those network wouldn't just be humans, right? It would be objects, and that those objects might talk to each other and do things. And that Internet of Things thing is really just a way of saying, well, now that you've got this infrastructure, we have this network, maybe there are other things that might work across that network. And over the last 20 plus years, that's been all kinds of sort of things. Sometimes it's been really lightweight sensors that are simply communicating, system on, system off. Sometimes they were more complicated things, requesting information, holding information, doing things on the basis of it. So think connected traffic lights and buildings and electrical grids. Some of those things started to become autonomous. So I suspect because of the aforementioned science fiction, our ideas about AI have been quite remarkable. And some of the ways that AI has turned up are very, very banal. It's elevators running an AI stack, which means that the elevators so in many buildings, particularly in New York City, I know there's a couple here, there in Sydney. If you were go into the lobby of the building, you'd wave a badge or push a number on a keypad and it would assign you to a carriage in the lift bank. You get into the lift carriage, there'd be no buttons. Once you get over that mild sense of panic, it'll deliver you to a floor. And that's all. It just happens in the background, right? What's also happening in the background, however, is that entire apparatus of the elevators are learning who's in the building and how they move through it. And they're anticipating where the traffic will be. They're anticipating where people will be. They are arranging themselves through the building so that they can take as much advantage of going down, which requires less energy than going up. And in any given building that has a knowable set of people who are there pretty regularly, the lifts, the elevators, start to behave differently over time. So I know one deployment where there are 3 buildings, 3 elevator stacks, all of them running AI, and the elevators in each building now behave differently because there are different people in the building doing different things. And so where the elevators arrange themselves in the building, waiting for people, because they know everyone leaves this building at 12:25 to go to a 12:30 lunch appointment, all the lift carriages are up here, elevator carriages waiting to come down. In the different building, they don't leave so much, so they're not kind of arranging themselves that way. So now imagine lots of other things are sitting on the network, getting smart about what people do, what other objects on the network do, and they can start to make decisions or automate processes. Now, you have to hasten to add here, just because those elevators are autonomous, i.e. deciding where they need to be, not waiting for a human to summon them, they are no longer coming at our beck and call, they are deciding where they need to be to respond to us. They're autonomous in that sense, right? They are not autonomous in the sense they plan to get out of the building and wander down Darling Harbour and stalk you. So you can be autonomous without getting off the rails, basically, right? They're autonomous because they can make a very particular set of decisions. They are not autonomous insofar as that they are fully self-determining mobile objects. And I think people sometimes misunderstand what it would mean for things to be artificially intelligent, and they imagine that it must be exactly like being an emancipated human. Forgetting, of course, that most humans can't do anything they want either. But the autonomous lifts are hardly the most, they can make a set of choices. They can't be anything they want to be. They can't decide to be a boat, for instance.
I want to ask a follow-up question to this. You talked in your TED talk about this building with an elevator on Bly Street, was it?
In Sydney, yeah.
In Sydney, yeah. And you said it was a proto-artificial intelligence. So what would it take for it to become artificial intelligence as opposed to proto-artificial intelligence?
Good question. And I think there'd be lots of debates about that, right? Some people would say the point at which it no longer needed any human input and that it was fully self-learning and it was deciding when it needed to upgrade itself, that it was running without any input from human beings. It clearly isn't. And I think, one of the things we will often see in spaces where objects need to be regulated. So where you have things that need to be certified, or where there needs to be a human override, or where they need to be maintained inside other systems, I suspect you're not going to get to fully self-determining, right? So the things may always be proto in that sense. Particularly when you've got systems inside systems. So in this case, where you have an elevator running inside a larger building that's doing other things, how you decide who gets to make the key decision. Like, is it the air conditioning, the lighting, the elevators, the front doors, the train system underneath? Those kind of orchestrations, I suspect, are A, going to take a really long time to sort out, and B, will always mean that some of those things may be intelligent, they may learn from themselves, but they may not be fully agentful in that sense. So for me, it doesn't feel like it's quite yet fully AI.
Okay, well, that helps because there are some few definitions that are weak in AI, like machine learning versus AI, when there's some overlap there. And
yeah, well, I tend to think of machine learning as a technique that makes it possible for systems to be artificially intelligent, right? Machine learning is not the same as AI. Machine learning is a technique for extracting value out of data sets and making the possibility of automating systems. Machine learning is not necessarily all the other pieces of AI, right? It's a technique in that sense. But I think you're absolutely right. People use them coterminously. People say algorithms, machine learning, AI, as though they were all the same thing. And clearly they are not, right? They are. I think the other thing is to remember that AI didn't start out as a technology. It started out as a research agenda. It was a group of people going, I think we want to look at this stuff over here, and their kind of call was that we'll be able to basically parse intellectual activity down into small enough pieces that a machine can be made to simulate it. And then we're going to look at basically what was speech recognition, computer vision, task augmentation, and self-learning. And those are the things they were interested in. Now, machine learning is a technique. Algorithms are a structured way to automate tasks. Algorithms existed long before contemporary AI. And certainly there are algorithms in your life that don't have AI in them. So if you have a washing machine at home that you bought in the last, 25 years, basically, and you go to that washing machine and you think, delicate, and you push the button that says delicate, or you spin the dial to delicate, or you render the little thing that gets you to the cycle delicate, you know that if you stick things in there, they won't get thrashed like if you said cotton. You are not having to stand in front of that machine unless you're particularly pedantic and decide the right temperature, the right spin cycle, the right number of rinses, and how long each one of those should happen. Someone has decided what the optimum way to automate those tasks inside your washing machine is, and that's an algorithm. It doesn't necessarily have AI in it. Some washing machines increasingly have more technology than seems reasonable, but that's just an algorithm, right? The same way many other things in your life have self-cleaning ovens are an algorithm. I can think of a whole lot of them, right? But they're algorithms that didn't need AI, and many of them don't even have fully formed computation sitting behind them, right? They are simply the automation of a set of tasks and a set of decision trees. If this, then that, then this, in this order. And so you can have algorithms long before you had AI. You can have algorithms that are built by humans, like the washing machine one, that says, if you do this, then you do this. You can have versions that instrument some form of computational smartness. So think about the one on Netflix that says, oh, Carolyn, you watch that? We think you're going to like these things too. And, that's not AI per se, but it's an algorithm that has a model in it. But the model is set a little bit by human intelligence, but profoundly fragmented and changed by the data that comes into it. And it is making decisions in real time about what you might like based on inordinate troves of data that suggest patterns. And it and the washing machine, both algorithms, but very different, right?
Yeah. So then my last question, I think we have a little time for it, is how did you get from anthropology to artificial intelligence? I've never seen that fork in the road before.
Well, actually, so I'm not the first person to do that. So cybernetics, the field that, I find my days in now, was started by a conversation between computer scientists in those days, who were mathematicians because they didn't have computer scientists yet, but between mathematicians and electrical engineers and physicists and anthropologists. So there were early anthropologists in the conversations that got us to today's computing. So Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, Theodora Schwartz, and others. How did I get here in particular? Well, I met a man in a bar in Palo Alto in 1998. And he changed my life. I was on the faculty at Stanford. I was teaching in the Department of Anthropological Sciences in those days. And I met a man in a bar, and he asked me what I did. And I said, I was an anthropologist. And he said, what's that? I said, I studied people. And he said, why? And I thought, what an odd question. And I said, because I thought they were interesting. He said, what do you do with that? I said, I'm an academic. And he said, couldn't you do more? And I thought, yes, I could stop talking to you, because this is pretty good for anthropologists being on the faculty at Stanford. I'm doing pretty well. And I didn't really think anything more of it. And he called me at home the next day, and we're talking 98. And I hadn't given him my number, because you don't give your number to strange men in bars. And he'd tracked me down. And we're talking before Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or Tinder or Google. These days, if you type redheaded Australian anthropologist into the internet search boxes, my name is usually the first thing that pops up. But in 1998, he called every anthropology department in the Bay Area looking for a redheaded Australian. And the secretary of the Stanford anthropology department said, oh, do you mean Genevieve? Do you want her home phone number? And so I got my first break into the Valley because, well, I was in a bar and Stanford had bad privacy practices. I stepped into that big break because it looked like a moment to do something completely different. And there was something extraordinary in the invitation to get to be in the middle of what I thought were the most important conversations about our future. I mean, if you can cast your mind back to 1998, which might as well be prehistoric at this point, but we were building the web then. The internet was still relatively novel in some ways, and the future felt like it was up for grabs. And I didn't want to be on the sidelines. I wanted to be in the middle. And so when Intel said, would you like to come and join us? We don't really know what you'll do. I thought, well, here's a company building the future. How could I say no to that? And so I stepped into the abyss with both feet, and with a kind of enthusiasm that, looking back at my younger self, is a little daunting, but I don't regret a single minute of it, not a single minute. And so I ended up in AI because I followed a series of unexpected forks in the road, and because I was willing to take every single one of them.
So was the person you met in the bar from Intel?
No, he wasn't actually. He was a serial entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, and Intel had some VC money in his company, and he ultimately introduced me to the people at Intel and to many of his friends and colleagues. And he stayed interested in my career after that. He's always been a kind advocate and champion. But it was an utterly accidental meeting, and one of those kind of moments of profound and utter serendipity.
Which bar, in case I wanted to go and see if I have an experience like that?
Oh, it was on Ramona in Palo Alto, and it's gone now. It's now a school.
Okay, the chance is gone then.
Yeah, no, when they demolished it, I did have this moment of great kind of like, oh, damn, that place changed my life. I still go stand outside of it whenever I'm in Palo Alto. It's just as a small homage to it, but yes, it's long gone.
Well, so I think we're coming up on the end of the time. Maybe I have 1 minute.
I don't know. David's reappeared at the bottom of the screen to tell us that we're done.
Not at all. I don't want to stop this. I have a couple of comments, but please, Carolyn, go.
I want you to know, David, I have put on lipstick on stages before. It wouldn't be the first time, sadly, at a live event. And I have bared my teeth at the bloke sitting next to me to go, do I have any lipstick on my teeth? And only to have the man sitting next to me recoil in horror, and the woman sitting beside him going, no, you're fine. And him going, I have no idea what just happened.
Well, so David, do you have a comment?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I was thinking back to when the internet was starting, and the web browser came out, the Netscape browser. It's almost, similar to where we are now, but with bandwidth, new business models coming out of COVID, how we're going to all interact together, right? Traffic models like you were talking about, Genevieve. Why can't people work a few days in the office or from different hours, right? And with the advancement of quantum computing and how we're just going to have so much computing power behind these things, I think it's just such an exciting time. We had a session earlier on supply chain, and then and the advancements there on like the global supply chains, but they were looking at it from the security standpoint. So I'm sure it's a whole other conversation for another day, right?
Absolutely. But I do think one of the things about the pandemic is that, and it has been and continues to be an incredibly complicating time, right? But I think one of the things that is clear about it is that it has made possible a series of massive social experiments, unplanned ones that we didn't go through a human subjects protocol for, no ethics clearance, but huge unplanned experiments around working from home, around virtual education, around healthcare delivery, around goods and services, and as you say, David, the supply chain. And I think that unplanned social experiment at scale has made visible some things to us that are very hard to unsee, like the complexity of our supply chains and their vulnerabilities, like the fact that teaching isn't just about standing in front of a classroom, that it requires all this work in the background, and that, asking people to teach remotely wasn't the ask that it looked like. It was much more complicated than that. And that some of the stories we've told ourselves about why you can't work from home may not be true. And I think how we choose as organizations, as companies, as governments, as citizens, as consumers to make sense of and do things differently as a result of all of that is both a daunting prospect and a huge opportunity. We were plunged into the pandemic very suddenly, certainly in Australia, and I think in some ways in the US too. And how we choose to exit it and the choices we make about both what we want to do as individuals and what we want to do collectively feels like a hopeful thing out of what doesn't feel like a lot of other hope.
Yeah, it will be interesting. I think many of the words you just said about working at home seem like in 93 when I heard the CEO of 3Com talking about the promises of the internet, telemedicine, working at home, right? Then the dial-up wasn't working, wasn't really getting us there fast enough. Imagine the pandemic with dial-up, right? So it's just amazing how I think, now we can reset things, and it's an exciting time.
Oh, absolutely. And reset it mindful of the fact that a lot of the technologies of the 21st century are built on technologies in the 20th century, and some of those are more brittle than we thought. I think, electricity, telecommunications, the supply chain, information technologies, we'd like them to be a little bit more robust than they sometimes turn out to be. And then, add the incredible reality of an existential threat of climate change. And I think you end up with a mix that says we're kind of compelled to do things a little bit differently. At least I feel compelled.
I have a question about your institute and your school.
Yes,
are you hiring people to work remotely, or how are you doing that?
So this year we've done some hiring, and that hiring has been a combination of hiring remotely and then people coming here. So Australia's had a very different experience of the pandemic than elsewhere. And because of the ways we managed it here, we closed our borders, we mandated a whole of country lockdown. We have moved a little more freely, I think, in some ways than in the US for at least the last 6 to 8 months. And so we've been back physically in the office for 6 months, which I know must sound a little shocking to some people. And so my team is all here with me in the building, and my students have been here too. So for us, we worked very hard to ensure that during the periods of lockdown, our students could continue to get an education. It's very different to deliver it virtually than in person. We continue to experiment with hybrid education. We have a much clearer sense, I think, at this point about what tasks are better when you can be co-present and what tasks are better when you're remote or virtual. And I think we have thought much more aggressively about something incredibly, again, like just mundane, but our business continuity plan about how we now think about whether you can fragment tasks. Like there are some things that, because we've got some local outbreaks going on again here and our vaccination rates have been terrible, we're facing into having to be remote again here. And we've been sort of working through what do we need to pull in and do right now when we can be physically co-present, and what can we push out that we would have to do in person later. And so we've had people working remotely, and that meant, making a series of choices for ourselves about what work could get done and what work we should just not try to do because it didn't make sense and it was too stressful. And then making sure, just again, all the kind of pragmatics of stuff. Does everyone have a ring light? There's a ring light here. Does everyone have like some kind of better microphone? There's a microphone here. How do we think about what works well and what doesn't? And so for us, it's been a big learning adventure, but it's been interesting. And yeah, we're usually hiring and we're certainly recruiting students. And if I were really sensible, I would stick my website into the URL so you could come play.
That's a good plan. Do that.
I am going to do that. Like I meant it. Oh, because truthfully, here's the other thing. If you are crazy enough, and I obviously am, to decide you were going to stand up a new school in the middle of a pandemic on a topic that people haven't really thought about in 40 years, and you still have enough hubris to say you're going to build a new branch of engineering in the Southern Hemisphere, here's the thing. You need as much help as you can get. And whilst the story of Silicon Valley may be the story of lone inventors, I would like to call bullshit on that story because I think it always involves a whole collection of people. Some of them acting in public and public facing, some of them as your advocates and champions and sponsors in the background, and usually because you are willing to say you don't want to do it alone and you need help. And I've always been willing to stand up and say, I can't do this by myself, and more to the point, I don't want to. And so the invitation is always there for people to come and participate, help, cheer us on from the sidelines, send us people that they think will want to be part of a demented adventure, and just spread the word a little bit because all of that really helps. And then you don't end up feeling quite so alone, right? Which I think can be sometimes one of the real challenges.
Yeah, I would think that there's an advantage to being there in person and collaborating. It just isn't the same if you're remote.
We've managed to create some genuinely sort of remarkable experiences virtually that I suspect we couldn't have otherwise. So we've had people be able to participate in our classrooms that could never have come here otherwise. So we've had voices in the room who couldn't have got here before the pandemic because it's a big ask to ask people to come to Australia and it's multiple, weeks out of their lives. And whereas I can get people for an hour that would never have been here before. So my students heard voices, and a shout out to gosh, so many people who've popped up in my classrooms who are amazing. Ma Hicks was here last week, 2 weeks ago. We've had all kinds of amazing women come and join us here, right, who wouldn't be able to be here otherwise. So there's that piece. And we've found ways to be a little bit playful, right? We have had cyber scavenger hunts and we've, watched movies together, and we have found ways to do things that I think would have been quite tricky otherwise, and to celebrate milestones that would have been impossible when we couldn't be together. So I'm with you, Carolyn. I prefer the in-person in lots of ways. Though that said, this formulation of me notwithstanding, I am shy and I am an introvert and I am desperately self-conscious about all things. So being caught picking on makeup on screen, always a good look. And there's something about some of the period of lockdown that was nice for me. Getting to spend a little bit of time in my own company was actually really pleasurable is the wrong word because it was such an awful circumstance, but there was something that was there was something about that moment that was interesting for me. And so I sort of want to balance not everyone wants to be in person all the time and not everyone wants that kind of moment. And so thinking about where can you make it a choice versus a necessity feels as important as anything in all of that.
Yeah, usually for me, when I have remote workers, you really have to have a well-defined task and pretty well-defined information. But for what you're doing, if somebody's brainstorming, sometimes getting away from everyone is a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's as much about what's the culture of an organization, how do you trust each other and support each other and feel like you're all in it together. So it's not a physical presence, which can sometimes be a proxy for, look, I'm here, look at me, I'm here, doesn't it? So, how you manage that, I think, is, endlessly kind of tricky.
So I want to do a time check here, Genevieve. We are 10 minutes over, but we'd love to keep talking to you if you have 5 more minutes.
Sadly, I think, Carolyn, I need to dial off because it is 11 o'clock in the morning here and my day is running.
Oh, okay. Well, Dr. Bell, it's been very nice having you and having you share your wisdom and your thoughts.
Well, it's been lovely to get to talk to you too, Carolyn. It's nice to get to see you again, David.
It is nice to see you too.
Thank you. And, our new CEO's Australian. So we're looking to really doing a lot of expansion there. You know, Michelle, I put the press release in the chat, and we're looking to how we can support both of you and all of you on the call and then we'll watch this video in the future as we can support your journey.
Excellent. Well,
tomorrow
the Australian takeover of all things.
Yes.
We used to lovingly in the Valley call that the Gumtree Mafia.
It's a secret takeover. Nobody knows it's happening.
I don't know how they can miss it. It's got a very distinctive accent. It's like that twang. It's like I can never turn up on conference calls anonymously. It's like, oh, that's Genevieve.
I love hearing it. I'm gonna tune up my old accent.
Good woman. So, you know, flatten those vowels out. Just talk about shark and park, and you'll be fine.
I'm gonna play this over and over. I'll be back by tomorrow.
Oh.
Thank you all so much. We're excited. We start in 11 hours. Some of you that's tomorrow, some of you it's later today, whatever it is. We're excited. Thank you so much, everybody. Summit.witty.com/agenda. Dr. Bell, you're the best. Dr. Turbyfill, you too. Michelle, what can I say?
All right. We're out of here.
Bye,
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Genevieve. Thank you.
You're welcome, Michelle. I'm off to go get another flat white.
Had a lot of those. Thank you.
Yeah, take it easy, mate. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.